Hello everyone, my name is Xingyi Du. I'm a PhD student from Washington University in St. Louis. Today I'm going to talk about our paper, Lifting Simplices to Find Injectivity. The problem we try to solve in this paper is computing maps between different shapes. Mapping is useful because it carries information from one shape to another. An example is texture mapping. Another example is data transfer. The mapping allows you to transfer data from a source mesh to a target domain. In both these applications, an injective, a so-called one-to-one mapping, is crucial because it ensures the information carried is well preserved. An injective mapping carries two different points in the source to two different points in the target. However, if one of the triangle gets collapsed to a degenerate one, or even further, to be flipped, the mapping is no longer injective. So for the mapping to be injective, you should guarantee there is no flip or degeneracy in the target. These applications motivate us to solve the problem of fixed boundary injective mappings. The input is a source mesh and the target boundary surrounding the target domain. The target boundary should correspond one-to-one to the boundary of the source mesh, and it should also contain no self-intersection. The output is a mapping from the source to the target without flip or degenerate triangles. So this means the mapping is injective. There has been lots of works on mappings. Some of them focus on minimizing mapping distortion. They take an injective but high distortion map and output an injective low distortion mapping. However, if the input is a non-injective mapping, they usually can't recover an injective mapping. As a result, they usually require injective mappings as initialization. Other works, they try to produce injective mappings. One of the most famous methods is Tat embedding. If your target domain is a 2D convex domain, Tat embedding will guarantee to give you an injective mapping into the domain. However, if the target domain is non-convex or in 3D, there is no guarantee. Recently, there has been some work to find injective mapping into non-convex domains. However, this method usually needs to change mesh structure and add a lot of new vertices. At last, there are some methods that try to produce injective mappings, but don't change mesh structure. Recent works in this direction include large-scale bounded distortion mappings, LBD, simplex assembly, SA, and fold-over frame mapping, FF. However, in practice, they usually fail on complex target domains. For example, here, the flipped elements are shown in red. Since our method also doesn't change mesh structure, we'll compare with LBD, SA, and FF method in the experiment section. Our contribution is a new method to produce injective mappings into fixed boundary domains in 2D and 3D, while maintaining mesh structure. Here shows how our method compute an injective mapping from the Lucy model to letter G. The key component of our contribution is a new energy called total lifted content, or TLC. In theory, the energy has this property. The global minimum of this energy are always injective mappings. And in practice, this method shows high success rate. To evaluate our method and compare with previous ones, we also construct a large benchmark dataset consisting of thousands of meshes. So next, I'll first talk about this new energy, and then we'll go through a few examples from the benchmark dataset. Okay, let's talk about total lifted content energy. The total lifted content energy is closely related to the total unsigned area energy, or TUA. As the name suggests, the total unsigned area energy is just the sum of all the areas of triangles in the mesh. A key observation is, when the map boundary is fixed, if there is no flip, the total area of triangles will be equal to the area of the fixed domain. Actually, we can plot the total unsigned area energy as a function of the blue vertex, as shown here. You can see, in the middle, there is a flat plateau region. However, if there are some flipped elements in the mesh, the total area of triangles will get larger, and the energy will increase. So, in conclusion, the global minimum of TUA energy means there is no flip. However, no flip doesn't necessarily mean the mapping is injective, because there could still be some degenerate triangles. For example, here is one degenerate triangle, but the total area is still at the global minimum. So this is an example of a non-injective global minimum of the TUA energy. Another problem is this energy is not smooth. You can see it's a piecewise linear energy, but between the different pieces, there are sharp edges, and the gradient is not well defined here. So this is really a bad news for the common optimization methods that require gradient information. We observe that both the non-smoothness and the non-injective global minimum happens when there are some degenerate triangles. So we need to deal with degeneracy. Here comes the key idea of our paper. Instead of computing areas in the 2D plane where the triangle can become degenerate, we first associate with each triangle T an auxiliary triangle, T tilde. We ask T tilde to be a fixed but non-degenerate triangle. We further combine the two triangles to get a lifted triangle. More precisely, the lifted triangle is obtained by concatenating the coordinates of the original triangle T and the auxiliary triangle T tilde. The idea is, even if the original triangle T becomes degenerate, the lifted triangle will not be degenerate because it always has some contribution from the auxiliary triangle, and the auxiliary triangle is not degenerate. So in conclusion, in the lifting space, there is no degenerate triangles. To further control the auxiliary triangle, we use a parameter called alpha. Alpha is simply used to change the size of the auxiliary triangles. We'll talk about this parameter later. Now, let's define the total lifted content, energy. The lifted content of one triangle is defined to be the area of the corresponding lifted triangle. Notice we are talking about triangles here, but everything here can be applied to tetrahedron. So the lifted content of a tetrahedron is defined to be the volume of the corresponding lifted tetrahedron. Now we define the total lifted content of a mesh to be the sum of all the lifted content of the simplices in the mesh. Notice in this experiment, we use equilateral auxiliary simplices, that is, equilateral triangles in 2D and regular tetrahedron in 3D. This is a simple choice, but turns out to be quite successful in practice. We'll show the results in the experiment section. Now let's compare total unsigned area and the total lifted content side by side. Total unsigned area energy is not smooth. It has non-injective global minimum. On the contrary, total lifted content is smooth. And even at the degenerate situation, since there is no plateau region here, the energy still has a descent direction, and the global minimum is injective. To conclude this section, we talk about the parameter alpha. Remember, alpha is used to control the size of auxiliary triangles. So when alpha equals 0, there is no contribution from the auxiliary triangle. So the lifted triangle area will be equal to the original triangle area. So when alpha equals 0, TLC energy will be the same as the total unsigned area. However, If we make alpha slightly larger, the TLC energy will be smooth, but still preserve the general shape of the total on-sand area. When we make alpha larger and larger, we get smoother and smoother energy. In fact, when alpha goes to infinity, we proved in the paper that the minimizer of TLC energy also minimizes the Dirichlet energy from the auxiliary simplices to the target simplices. In particular, since we are using equilateral auxiliary simplices, this means TLC, when alpha goes to infinity, will give you taut embedding as a result. On the other hand, when alpha goes to 0, we proved the minimizer of TLC also minimizes Dirichlet energy, but this time from the target simplices to auxiliary simplices. In 2D, this energy is actually known as the MIPS energy. Notice that we have a final result about TLC energy at its global minimum. We proved in the paper that the global minima of TLC energy for a finite small range of alpha will always be injective. Okay, so notice that this theoretical result is only about global minima. In practice, using some solvers, we can only hope to get local minima of the energy. So in practice, we use gradient-based solvers to minimize TLC. And to evaluate our method, we construct a large benchmark dataset. Notice our benchmark dataset, part of the benchmark dataset comes from previous paper in this direction. We also create some new examples using recent methods. Here shows a simple example. Here is a simple grid example with a hole in the middle, and we map it to a similar region, but the center square boundary is rotated by 180 degrees. We initialize the mapping using taut embedding, given its close relation to TLC energy. However, taut embedding creates 8 flipped triangles. We also try the total on-sand area. However, due to the non-smoothness and the flatness of the energy, it gets stuck and can't retain an injective mapping. If we make alpha slightly larger and optimize TLC energy, we get an injective result. Notice we use this alpha parameter value for all the experiments in the benchmark. For comparison, we show the result of FF, LBD, and SA. Notice even in this simple example, this previous method, not all of them can succeed. Let's look at more complex 2D example, where an ego mesh is mapped to a 2D domain. Here again, taut embedding creates some flipped elements on the boundary due to the highly non-convex shape of this target domain. Our method succeeds, while the FF method can't fully remove the flipped triangles. Let's look at a 3D parameterization example, where a tetrahedral mesh is mapped into the interior of a polycube domain. Again, taut embedding creates more flipped tetrahedrons in 3D. Our method also still succeeds, but the SA method can't give you an injective mapping. Finally, let's look at a 3D deformation example. Given an armadillo, we perform deformation to get a sequence of deformation frames. And we want to map the interior of the armadillo into each frame. Let's see an example. In this frame, taut embedding creates lots of flipped elements. Our method succeeds, but LBD method can't give you an injective mapping. We plot the number of flipped elements in LBD method versus the frame number, and this frame is shown at this point. Let's look at a later frame at the end of the deformation sequence. Here, tight embedding creates even more flipped elements. We still succeed, but the LBD method also gives you more flipped elements. And the point is here. For each frame, if there are some flipped elements in the LBD result, we plot a point and get this graph. It shows as the frame number gets larger and larger, the target mesh gets more and more twisty. The LBD method will tend to produce more and more flipped elements. In summary, there are three categories in the benchmark: 2D parameterization, 3D parameterization, and 3D deformation. In each category, there are hundreds of testing meshes. And here, we show the success rate of finding injective mappings of all the methods we compare to for each category. Notice the green bar, which is our method. Notice the green bar, which is our method, achieves the highest success rate in all categories. In fact, our method achieves 100% success on the whole benchmark dataset. On the contrary, for other methods, and from left to right, as the mesh examples become harder and harder, this method has less and less success rate. Notice that even we have the highest success rate, the running time of TLC method is on par with previous method. Please look at the paper for more details. In conclusion, we propose a new energy total lifted content for computing injective mappings. In theory, it guarantees the injective mapping are found at global minimum. And in practice, it has high success rate. To evaluate and compare different methods, we construct a large benchmark dataset for injective mappings. In the future, we would like to explore several interesting directions. First, our theoretical result only concerns about global minimum of TLC, but it would be very interesting and practically related if we can talk about the local minimum property. Another direction is to explore different types of auxiliary simplices. Currently, we are only using equilateral ones, but there are a lot more other choices. We would like to see if different choice of auxiliary simplices can change the ability of TLC energy to find injective mappings. We have published the code and dataset of our paper online on this dataset. If you are interested in our method or dataset, please go to this website and try it yourself. Thanks for listening.